Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on worker-driven social responsibility, or WSR, and especially for joining under the current circumstances. We realize that the situation at the moment is particularly difficult for those providing frontline services, and that many of you have children at home. So we decided to go ahead with the webinar as planned, but we have shortened the session in recognition that people may not be able to dedicate the full 2 hours to this topic at this time. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lucila Granada, and since July last year, I'm the CEO of Focus on Labor Exploitation, FLEX. We're a UK-based research and policy advocacy organization that works to end human trafficking for labor exploitation. We do this by highlighting the structural issues that drive labor abuse and exploitation, by providing policymakers with clear evidence-based strategies and prevention, and by centering the experiences of workers and trafficked persons in policymaking. We're co-hosting this webinar with the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, or WSRN for short. We will hear from them in a minute, but WSRN was established in 2015 by a group of worker organizations, allies, and technical advisors for the purpose of expanding, promoting, and replicating the WSR model in supply chains around the world. The network builds understanding of the WSR model among relevant actors, provides support and coordination for worker-led efforts to replicate the model, and works to establish WSR as the baseline for workers' rights programs within global supply chains. So why this topic? Flex has previously done research on corporate social responsibility initiatives, such as the Section 54 of the UK's Modern Slavery Act, which many of you will know as a transparency in supply chains reporting requirement for companies. We now wanted to explore WSR as a model that has been successful in tackling human rights and labor rights violations in some of the most challenging contexts globally. So in particular, we wanted to scope and understand the potential of WSR model in a context like the UK, which is quite different to the ones where WSR has been implemented to date. So in a minute, we will have our first panel. We have Theresa, Haas, and Sarah Newell from WSRN, who will introduce us to this model. And then Abel from Migrant Justice, who will talk about their experience implementing a WSR program in practice. We will then have 15 minutes for questions and then a second panel with a presentation from my colleague Meri Ahlberg, who will speak about our scoping research project looking at the applicability of the model to the UK context. And finally, Chango from IWGB, a union organizing workers in precarious sectors in the UK, who will talk about their strategy. The second panel will be chaired by Theresa from WSRN, and we will have another 15 minutes for Q&A after that panel. So before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Using Zoom webinar is new for us, so please bear with us if we find any technical glitches. This session will be recorded and put on our website shortly after the webinar. And finally, if you have any questions and you would like to ask any questions, please do so. You have two options to do this. You can either click on the button that says raise your hand. We will then unmute your microphone so that you are able to speak and make your comment or question. From WSR Network. Theresa is the director of Transnational Strategies as WSRN. Prior to joining WSRN in 2016, Theresa served as the director of communications for the Workers' Rights Consortium, WRC, an independent labor rights monitoring organization which works to protect and defend the rights of workers who make clothing and other consumer goods. While at WRC, she helped to develop and launch the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a legally binding agreement between workers and apparel brands to make factories safe. We will also hear from Sarah Newell, also from WSRN. Sarah is the Director of Outreach and Communications at WSRN, and prior to joining WSRN, Sarah was Communications and Campaign Coordinator for the International Labor Rights Forum, ILRF, a human rights organization dedicated to advancing dignity and justice for workers in the global economy. At the ILRF, they campaign in support of Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. And in addition, Sarah worked as a union organizer with SEIU Healthcare Pennsylvania, and later the American Association of University Professors. Theresa, Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Great, let me just share my screen here. We can get started. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today in the midst of everything going on in the world. I think I've been reflecting a lot on how the need for worker-driven solutions is even more prescient in the face of everything that we're seeing globally. So I'm excited to be here today to continue talking about what we're trying to build in the long term. So I'll start out with a little bit about the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network and the conditions that led to the creation of the model and the creation of the network. And then I'll pass over to Theresa to talk a little bit more about the specific principles and the specific programs that the network works on. So one problem that I'm sure we are all familiar with as folks working in the global supply chain is the rise of mega buyers like Walmart pictured here, but as well as many, many others, and how these mega buyers have consolidated buying power at the top of the global supply chain. So the global supply chain is imbalanced with a huge amount of power at the top and not a lot of resources at the bottom. And this, of course, has caused worsening conditions for millions and millions and millions of workers. And, you know, we're familiar with stories like this one featured here about workers facing forced labor and human trafficking on farms, workers facing building safety crises in sweatshops producing garments. And, you know, these worsening conditions have become almost normalized as just the way it is in producing countries. And this, of course, has led to extremely preventable tragedies. This picture is, of course, the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh in April 2013. That, you know, absolutely could have been prevented with the presence of worker-driven social responsibility programs. So as an enforcement mechanism, corporate self-regulation has failed. That's a principle that worker-driven social responsibility is based on. In response to these tragedies, corporations responded largely with public relations exercises, with unenforceable programs that are designed to protect the interests of the brand rather than to protect workers on the ground. So when we think about what a corporate self-regulation program would be, it's something that is voluntary. It doesn't have either legally binding commitments or commitments that are enforceable with market consequences. And those consequences are not clear. So you can think about some of the inspectors who audited the Rana Plaza building before the collapse in Bangladesh and certified it, and signed off that it was safe for workers to continue working in. And there's no clear consequences when something like that happens. It's a oops, I'm sorry. And then these corporate programs have no clear role for workers. Workers aren't part of the drafting and design of the program and often aren't involved in the enforcement of it. They are seen as a passive participant in the program. Also, these programs have little or no transparency, and transparency is a really key element here. Programs are entirely internal, have no obligation to disclose anything to the public, make public what they wish to, and keep other things secret under the guise of, trade secrets or things like that. But this transparency is really key for workers to be able to see what the programs are doing and whether or not they're effective. And then finally, and some could argue the largest thing, is a failure of these programs to address root causes. There are plenty of programs that want to, build a school or sign folks up for literacy or bank account classes, but there aren't programs that get to the root of the causes of the poverty wages and of the experiences that workers are having on the ground, which has to do with the three we talked about at the beginning, the consolidation of power at the top of the supply chain. So in response to this series of problems and the way the global supply chain has developed, workers came together and the network came together with worker groups to develop social responsibility programs that protect their own human rights. So the worker-driven social responsibility network in comparison to corporate social responsibility is created by the workers themselves, who have an abiding interest in protecting their own human rights and know best precisely what they need to do that. So the network came out of two programs, the Bangladesh Accord and the Fair Food Program. The Fair Food Program is in the United States, for folks who aren't familiar, in Florida, and it has now grown to be across the entire United States East Coast. But it started in the tomato farms in Immokalee, Florida, where workers were dealing with human trafficking and forced labor, and created this binding and enforceable program in response to that. So you had these two programs operating at totally different scales, totally different environments, really addressing different issues. The Accord's focused on building safety and health and safety, and the Fair Food Program is focused more on wages and specific working conditions in the farms, but they were based on the same set of principles. So practitioners and proponents of the model from both sides came together and formed this diverse coalition of groups to not only promote the model and talk about why it's important that these things be worker driven, but to help other groups who want to implement this model and help worker organizations get these programs off the ground. We're going to hear from one of those organizations a little bit later. I'll pass it over to Theresa now to talk about some of the principles that underlie this work.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So what I want to do is cover 6 principles that make up the worker-driven social responsibility model. And I want to just note that, it's important that these principles all be taken together. These programs and the types of changes that they generate in supply chains do not work if you pick and choose from these principles and take one but not the others. And so all of these principles work together in their entirety as a model to create the types of change that we've seen in the programs that Sarah was referring to. And so the first principle is that labor rights initiatives must be worker driven. And so what this means is that for any program that is intended to improve the situation for workers on the ground, workers and their organizations, whether that be trade unions, worker centers, or other groups that genuinely represent the interests of workers, they must be at the head of the table in creating and implementing the program. And this is fundamentally different from the voluntary initiatives that Sarah was referring to under corporate social responsibility and multi-stakeholder initiatives, where under those programs, the problem that's being solved is typically a public relations crisis that is the result of the revelation of gross human rights abuses in companies' supply chains. And in the case of WSR, we define the problem completely differently. It's not a PR crisis that's trying to be solved. It's the actual human rights crisis itself that is what we're trying to address when workers are driving the program. So things like unsafe factories, extreme poverty, forced labor, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence, those are the conditions that workers set out to eliminate when they create a social responsibility program for their own workplace. Next slide, Sarah. So second, obligations for corporations must be binding and enforceable. So we know from experience that human rights in corporate supply chains cannot be optional or voluntary, and that effective enforcement is the key to success of any social responsibility program. And specifically, worker organizations must be able to enforce the commitments of brands and retailers as a matter of contractual obligation. So as an example, in the case of the Bangladesh Accord, when a supplier refuses to address dangerous safety hazards, that factory is expelled from the program, and the 200 plus signatory brands have to stop sourcing from that factory, and there are no exceptions to that. There are similar consequences that exist under the Fair Food Program in the US agricultural sector as well. And these certain and specific market consequences send a very clear message to the suppliers that operate under the program about the kinds of activities and conditions that will and will not be tolerated. And this very clear message and enforcement has prompted tremendous transformation in these industries. Third, under WSR, buyers must afford suppliers the financial incentive and capacity to comply with labor standards. So we know from years of research and experience that corporations at the top of supply chains place constant downward price pressure on their suppliers. And this, of course, then translates into downward pressure on wages and labor conditions. And through this mechanism, the market actually incentivizes abuse. So instead, under WSR, corporations are required to incentivize respect for human rights through offering either a price premium, negotiated higher prices, or other financial incentives that enable their suppliers to afford the additional cost of compliance that comes with complying with higher labor standards. Fourth, under WSR, consequences for non-compliant suppliers must be mandatory. So the obligations of global brands and retailers under WSR programs have to include the imposition of meaningful, swift, and specific economic consequences when suppliers violate workers' human rights, whether or not ending the relationship with that supplier suits the specific economic and logistical convenience of the brand or retailer in that given moment. And only programs that include these specific economic consequences can really genuinely ensure protection for workers' rights in all cases. Fifth, the gains for workers must be measurable and timely. So one of the things that has persisted for many years under voluntary programs is the ability of brands and retailers to obscure the failure of these initiatives. And that has really been helped by the fact that voluntary initiatives lack any kind of concrete measurable outcomes at the workplace level by specific deadlines. And so in order to ensure accountability, any program that is designed to correct specific labor rights problems has to include objectively measurable outcomes and clear deadlines. And then finally, the verification of workplace compliance must be both rigorous and independent. So currently, under traditional CSR programs, workplace audits, which are often infrequent and are never free of buyer influence, are really the exclusive monitoring mechanism of these traditional CSR programs, and they've proven inadequate time and time again. And so effective verification of supplier compliance is essential. It has to include inspections by individuals who have a deep knowledge of the industry and the labor issues, who operate independently of financial control and influence from the buyers, accompanied by in-depth worker interviews that are carried out under conditions where workers are able to speak freely, and supplemented by an effective complaint resolution mechanism that workers can access if there are violations. And so those 6 principles really make up the WSR model. And I want to just touch very quickly and mention that there are currently 4 WSR programs in operation in the world. And in the next section, we'll touch on 2 of them in detail. We'll talk about the Bangladesh Accord and the Milk with Dignity program. But just to very quickly mention the other 2, the Fair Food Program is a program in the Eastern United States agricultural industry. It was a program that was created by an organization there called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which came together in the early 2000s to address longstanding issues of poverty, abuse, as well as several cases of slavery in the Florida tomato sector. They came together to run a campaign, and they were ultimately able to succeed in getting 14 major food retailers to sign agreements to protect the rights of workers in the Florida tomato industry. That program has now expanded to cover a number of states across the US Eastern Seaboard. And then the other program I'll mention quickly, which is our newest program, is the program around gender justice in the SLU2 apparel industry. That is a program that was created after an agreement was signed in August 2019 to address longstanding and deeply endemic issues of gender-based violence and sexual harassment in 5 denim factories in Lesotho. It's a program that's based on an agreement between 3 major denim brands, including Levi's, Contour Brands, and The Children's Place, and 5 trade unions and women's rights organizations in Lesotho. And that program is now being operationalized as a result of the agreement that was signed last year. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Abel Luna at Migrant Justice, who's going to talk with us about the Milk with Dignity program in the US.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm just gonna quickly do my screen sharing as well. Okay, I think that should be working fine. Yeah, my name is Abel Luna. I'm an organizer with Migrant Justice. Migrant Justice is an organization based out of Burlington, Vermont. And it was built by farm workers, led by farm workers. Basically our mission is to work with the community, empower the migrant community to transform the reality that people are facing on the dairy farms in Vermont, working with allies to support us as well. And yeah, so just to give a little bit of background on the dairy industry. For example, oh, you guys can see my presentation. Can you guys see it now?
We saw it for a moment, but now it's disappeared again.
Okay. Huh. Is it there now?
Yeah, now it's there.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so just to give a little bit of the context on the mill with on the dairy industry, there's about 1,500 to 2,000 migrant farm workers in the dairy industry, maintaining and sustaining some of the most famous brands of cheese, ice cream, some of the dairy products that end up on our table. Yeah, so we in the past sort of 4 years we ran a survey, surveying about 300 workers. We found a lot of issues that are happening in the dairy industry. For example, workers are working 60 to 80 hours per week. Some people, half of the surveys that we did, people have no days off. So workers are working 7 days per week, no days off, and that goes on for many years. There's lack of rest, adequate sleep. Lack of, for example, there's a lot of like old housing. A lot of workers are sleeping in crowded housing, 2 to 3 people sharing a room. Sometimes there's no water or drinkable water on the farms. And heating in Vermont, in Vermont, it gets really cold. And that's another issue. A lot of the workers don't have adequate housing. And injuries that are related to the nature of the dairy industry, working with big animals, and also lack of, for example, labor protections. Yep, and so those are some of the things that that we see that are happening, yeah. So what are we sort of doing about it? What are we sort of doing to transform the reality that people are facing, right? And so just to add to that a little bit, there's also some of the issues that we also find on farms, sexual harassment and human trafficking in some cases. Those are some of the issues that are happening. And so what are we doing to change that? So after having the survey results, workers got together, and so we knew that we started to look for a model across the country, a model, but not just any model. We knew that in order to transform, our industry and to address those issues that we were just mentioning, we needed some type of enforcement, right? An enforcement mechanism where workers can complain and where workers can speak up without being retaliation and without being fired. And that's something that happens in the dairy industry. You speak up, you're fired, and we needed something different. And so we started to look for models across the country, and we came across the coalition of the locally workers in Florida with the Fair Food Program. So we went down to Florida, learned about the model, about the different components of the model, and you know, the new day that tomato workers are talking about in the tomato fields, and we wanted to see what that is like. So we went down there for many months, understood the model, and then we came back to Vermont, and tried to adapt it to the dairy industry. And you know, basically out of the survey results, all of that, we created a code of conduct. And once we had that ready, we started to, you know, the code of conduct and other components, such as education and the program figured out. We started to look for a company to invite to join the program. You know, we invited Ben and Jerry's. It's our corporation that was, you know, talking about human rights and animal welfare, and everything sort of being perfect. And we invited them to join the program, and to our surprise, you know, they say no. They said that, you know, that this wasn't this wasn't their issue, and that we needed to look somewhere else. You know, but we knew that the survey results were telling us something different. That there's issues are happening, and basically what Ben and Jerry's were saying, you know, is that they had a program in place called Caring Dairy, that was exactly doing what it's supposed to do, you know, looking into issues, human rights issues, animal welfare issues, and sort of the land and water. But the results told us something different, and we knew that we needed to do something. So Ben and Jerry's wasn't responding, wasn't joining the program, and so we launched the campaign. It lasted about 2.5 years, and you know, after 2.5 years, Ben and Jerry's finally signed the Meal with Dignity agreement, and it's been a very transformative sort of moment in for farm workers. And just to give you some idea of sort of what's happening now after the second year of implementation, we just started our third year of implementation, just completed the second, and in 2 years we have seen so much change by having a corporation, you know, use their power basically. So 65 farms have enrolled under the Meal with Dignity program. Over 250 workers have received the education. Um, uh, Farm workers and farmers as well, and this covers about 20% of the dairy industry. Um, and talking about that power of the third-party mechanism, um, you know, there has been over 250 complaints, calls to the worker support line, um, uh, have been investigated, and over 185 of them have resulted in some sort of code violation. And 79% of those calls that people, you know, make has led to farm improvements. So, you know, it's a change. Things are happening. Things are the dairy industry is changing. By using this model, um, and also, you know, just to share a little bit more on what the new day it's like on the dairy industry under the Meal with Dignity program. Over $925,000 have been spent on improvement on the farm, such as vacations, days off, wage raises, unpaid wages that were owed to workers when the farm started participating, personal protection equipment, sick leave benefits, and so those are some of the things that you know that have started to change. And to be very specific, for, over 525,000 paid in wages by farms to reach the Vermont minimum wage, and that is a huge step forward. And 175,000 in worker bonuses. So you know that really speaks to the power of the program. You know, we would not have been able to do this if it was just going farm by farm. But you know, having the power of the company behind us, using their purchasing power, saying you know, the farm where I'm buying my milk from, they have to respect this code of conduct, and they have to do this. And if you don't, you know, there are consequences, and that's what we as farm workers, that's what we want, the consequences when there are people violating our human rights and our dignity. And the only way to do that was by creating a program and have corporations join, and they can enroll the entire supply chain. It's impossible to do it farm by farm, and it's impossible to do it through you know, a CSR program that it's not on the ground, that is not talking to workers, that is not going to worker housing, that is not interviewing workers. And that is what the Mill with Dignity Standards Council does. That is our enforcement mechanism, going to talking to workers and understanding, if things are changing. If not, there are consequences when our rights are violated. And that is the power of the model, of the WSR model. It's only in 65 farms right now in Vermont, and the idea is that it can grow. And that's why we are now calling on Hannaford supermarkets to join the Mill with Dignity program and to be a champion in human rights as well, to protect the rights of farm workers that are working in their dairy supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abel. We have now a bit of time for questions, and we have a couple of questions coming in. Please keep sending your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I have a first question is from Steph. He's saying, I'm relatively familiar with the Fair Food program. How much does it cost for suppliers and buyers? Is it scalable across all supply chains? I guess this one is for Sarah or Theresa.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a good question. I think I don't have numbers on the tip of my finger about specifically how much it costs. I think probably, I assume what you're referring to is the question about the penny per pound commitment. So one of the main demands of the campaign was for buyers to pay an additional penny per pound for the tomatoes that workers picked in the fields to help supplement the very low wages that they were earning. And that cost varies depending on how much tomatoes or how much of the particular produce item that the buyer is buying. But it's, in comparison to the profit margins of the buyers that we're talking about, it's an extremely small, negligible amount for them, but it's deeply meaningful in terms of improving wages for workers. So, I think in terms of the question of whether it's scalable, I think it's absolutely scalable. I mean, one of the fundamental problems that we have to address in supply chains is the price pressure, the downward price pressure on wages and conditions. And so the Fair Food Premium is one way to address it. There are other mechanisms, but fundamentally, if we're going to address labor abuses at the base of supply chains, it has to require brands at the top paying more money for the goods that they purchase.
Thank you, Theresa. Second question also is for either of you. Have you considered using worker voice to measure efficiency gain for workers?
Sarah, do you want to take that one?
I don't know that I totally understand the question.
Are you referring to a specific worker voice technology or the general concept of worker voice?
The person asking the question doesn't clarify, but I would imagine.
Okay. So I'll just address the sort of general concept of worker voice, and I'll actually paste in the chat box here a link to a piece that we put out alongside with some academics who work on issues of labor rights and supply chains. And I'll just say that, from our perspective, the concept of worker voice, theoretically is a very important one. The idea that workers should have a voice in their conditions of work and the way that they're treated in the workplace is absolutely critical. But the problem is that this relatively new concept of worker voice is essentially repeating all of the same problems of voluntary CSR programs of the past, where it's not actually providing any new genuine forms for workers to have impact, influence, and control over the conditions of their workplace. A lot of these new worker voice initiatives are essentially just apps through which workers can, voice concerns or express concerns about what's going on in the workplace without any meaningful way to address any problems that they raise. So there's still no enforcement. There is still no genuine independent auditing that's happening. And so this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about you cannot take one principle and leave the others. Worker voice is important, but you cannot have genuine worker voice if you do not have enforcement of labor standards and a real way for workers to actually participate and control the conditions of their workplace.
Thank you. The next question is from John Dale. Can you explain how the worker-driven social responsibility framework differs from the UN guidelines for business and human rights? And in what ways does the latter fall short of addressing the kinds of worker empowerment for labor rights that the WSR principles enunciate?
I can answer that. It's the binding and enforceable part. The problem with the UN guidelines on business and human rights isn't the content of the guidelines themselves, it's the fact that they are guidelines and human rights are not optional.
Thank you. We'll have a few more questions, very little time actually, but the next one is, in order to improve working conditions for laborers, we need to convince the importance of this to employers. Yet, if an employer agrees to use modern forms of slavery in his or her company, he or she has a fundamental disinterest in the human well-being of those who work for him or her. Are there ways of working you can suggest to engage employers or to convince employees, to convince employers of the benefits of improving working conditions?
Sure, Sarah or Abel, do you want to take that one? Otherwise, I'm happy to. Abel, maybe this is something you can speak to with the farms in Vermont.
Yeah, that is a great question. We've organized for many years in Vermont, and we sort of have talked to many different farms, many different conversations with farmers. And you know, and in our experience, it's sort of impossible sort of to change the reality sort of that people are facing, unless you have sort of workers, you know, directly involved and directly sort of saying what they want and what they need. And the only way that we have found it to be successful is through the program, where you know, for example, where there are consequences if people sort of don't comply with their rights. And so, yeah, we've tried to have different conversations in different ways, you know, with farmers, but nothing changes. The only way that we have been able to do it is by have a corporation sort of take responsibility for the whole supply chain and actually use their buying power and say, you know, this is something that I, as a company, I'm stepping behind this model, and I'm stepping behind this program, and I'm going to use my buying power, you know, to transform that reality. And I need you guys as part of my supply chain to do, you know, what I need you guys to do. And if not, there, you know, you guys won't be able to sell to me. And I think, you know, that is the only way to really do it. Yeah.
Thank you. Abel, we have one more question for you. Was it difficult to get Ben & Jerry's to sign up to the Milk with Dignity? What were the main challenges?
It was challenging. It was a 2.5-year campaign, and part of the challenges, I think, was, as I mentioned, they have the Caring Dairy program, and you know, as when we approached them, you know, they told us that this program was doing, you know, everything that they needed, talking you know, about workers being fine on the farm, wages, schedules, and everything. And also, you know, talking about like the animal welfare and all of that. And so in their mind, as a company, as a corporation, they created something that worked for them, so that they can say, this is our supply chain. This is what it looks like. Everything is good and everything is fine and perfect. And that worked for them. And, you know, I want to make that very clear. But when we ran the survey and we went to different farms and talked to workers, their reality was different. You know, there were people that had not stepped out of the farm for, you know, for 7 years, for 6 years. People that have not getting, you know, are getting paid $6.25 an hour. People that are working, you know, 12 hours without a lunch break. And that was their reality. that they did not want to understand because they thought that through this program that they had, these problems didn't existed. And that's when we sort of took to the streets. And so it was a little bit of that, sort of getting them to understand that, you know, there are issues and it is real. And by you sort of buying a lot for like cheaper amounts, that creates downward pressure that then, you know, translates into farmer sort of having less money, and then translates into workers sort of, you know, experiencing those issues. And it was a little bit of that, you know, the reality, but also, you know, that I think, yeah, that.
Thank you. We have still a few more minutes. So the next question is the obligation to serve contracts with suppliers something that has been implemented? In how many cases, roughly?
Yes, sure. So I'll speak to that quickly. So yes, it has been implemented. I can share one example, which is under the Bangladesh Accord. There are, I believe, 180 factories that have been designated as ineligible for signatory brands to source them because those factories were unwilling to operate safely. And I just pasted a link in the chat box where anybody can actually go to the Bangladesh Accord's website and search and find a list of those factories that are ineligible. It's also, it's been done under the Fair Food Program as well. In the case of the Lesotho agreement, because the agreement only covers 5 factories, the obligation is slightly different. The obligation for the brand is actually to reduce orders to a level sufficient to compel compliance. So you have to make slight modifications when you're talking about a very small number of factories, like in that agreement. But yes, in all of the cases and all of the programs, that obligation has been implemented and enforced.
Thank you. And one last question for this panel. There are a few other questions that we won't be able to do now, but maybe we can respond to those at the end in the second Q&A. So we have, with respect to Principle 2, how does the requirement for a brand to cease working with a supplier actually improve the conditions for the workers? And without absolute transparency, there will be another brand willing to accept it, actually for a lower price.
Yeah. Sarah, Abel, do you want to take that one? Otherwise, yeah. So I think, you know, this is a really important one because so it's important to do a couple of things. So it is important to actually require suppliers that are unwilling and unable to operate responsibly. It's important to require brands to terminate business from them. And we understand that brands are often unwilling to do that it can disrupt their supply chains. It can cause them to have to terminate business with the supplier that they've worked with for a very long time. It's also never the first step that a brand under a program is required to take. A brand is always required to take a number of steps to try to bring that supplier into compliance, including offering the types of financial incentives that are necessary to allow that supplier to meet its obligations under the program. So it's never a case that a brand would simply be required to terminate business with a supplier without taking a number of steps, including financial ones to ensure remediation. But if all of those steps are taken and a factory is still unwilling or a farm is still unwilling to operate safely or in compliance with the program, it absolutely does need to be removed from the program. You know, in the case of the Bangladesh Accord, those factories were unwilling to operate safely, and any one of them could have been the next Rana Plaza. And so it's important that business be terminated. It's also important that those factories were published so that other brands were aware that those factories were unwilling to operate safely, and other brands could look at that list and hopefully make the same decision that they were also not going to source from those factories that were unwilling to operate safely. And those decisions are made under these programs with workers and their organizations, their unions, being part of those decisions. So these are not decisions that are made without the input of workers. They're made because workers and their organizations also believe and agree that if at the end of the day a supplier is not willing to operate responsibly or safely, no one should be sourcing there.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have a few more questions, but to make sure that speakers have enough time to present, we will move on to the second panel. If we have time and the second Q&A, we will try to respond to some of the remaining questions. So over to you.
Great, thanks. So I'm gonna, for the next section, I'm gonna introduce Meri. So Meri is Flex's research manager and works on a number of projects seeking to uncover and tackle drivers of labor abuse and exploitation. Prior to joining Flex in 2017, she was a gender and labor migration consultant at the ILO's regional office for Asia and the Pacific. While at the ILO, she worked on a 6-country project to promote the developmental impact of labor migration in Southeast Asia, and in a joint project with UN Women to prevent the exploitation of women migrant workers in the Asian region. And I'll turn it over now to Meri.
Thank you very much. I'm also just gonna share my screen. Great, so I hope you're all able to see the PowerPoint slides. Sorry. Great, so as Theresa introduced me, thank you very much. I'll be talking through some of the findings from our recently published report, which examines WSR as a model for tackling labor abuse in supply chains. And to give you some background, so the starting point of our research was that we had been looking at corporate social responsibility measures and finding that despite a lot of good intentions, few of them were really managing to achieve real change on the ground for workers. And therefore, when we heard about WSR and the successes it had had in really difficult contexts, we were really interested in exploring that further. And specifically, we wanted to understand how WSR works, because for us it was a completely new program, but also to scope how it might fit new contexts, specifically using the UK and as a case study, and also looking at a service sector, so the hotel sector, as a kind of case study, because up until now, WSR has mainly been implemented in agriculture and garment production, so not in service sectors. And in terms of looking at kind of how it might fit into new contexts, we wanted to specifically scope how the model would relate to and interact with UK trade unions and state labour market enforcement. And that was because we felt it was really important that we didn't shift responsibility for protecting workers' rights away from the state, or in any way kind of replace or hinder trade unions. I'm not going to go into the methodology because I've realized that my presentation is a bit long. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. But what we started with this research is really looking at why this model is needed. And Theresa and Sarah kind of touched upon this, but I think it's important to reiterate. Because what we found is that work is increasingly fractured with kind of longer and more complex supply chains. And this has been true for manufacturing for a long time. So with, for instance, the production of garments being kind of outsourced and offshored by the global north to the global south. But this is also increasingly the case for the service sector, where jobs like cleaning, catering, and security that used to be in-house are increasingly outsourced to kind of specialized companies that provide those services. And as was being said, in certain sectors, the power as a result of this fracturing has really been consolidated at the top of the supply chain. So brands at the top of the supply chain are able to leverage their purchasing power to benefit from lower prices. And as a result, suppliers and contractors have to compete for work with each other based on price, which leads to this downward pressure on wages and conditions. And in order for them to maintain their profit margins, because they can't push up against the brand at the top, they then instead push down and squeeze workers. And what this leads to is kind of wages and conditions at the very minimum and sometimes below. The intensification of work, and also increasingly precarious and non-standard contracts. So what we mean by that is 0-hour contracts, the casual contracts, people being employed for instance, on very part-time contracts. We see this in cleaning, where we're doing currently research where people will be employed for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, but not paid for those hours in between. What we also found is that the current systems that exist for protecting workers' rights are really struggling to keep up with this change that has happened. So if we look at labour laws in a lot of countries, including the UK, lead companies are often let off the hook. So there's no liability for the labour abuses that are happening in their supply chains, even though they have this kind of ability to influence wages and conditions further down. What we also found is labour market enforcement often doesn't work for all groups of workers, specifically those who tend to be further down the supply chains. So it might work for directly employed workers, but it won't work in the same way for the outsourced cleaners or security guards or caterers, who tend to disproportionately be from marginalised groups, so more likely to be migrants, Black and minority ethnic, or women. Then secondly, collective bargaining, trade unions have kind of traditionally been the ones that are protecting workers' rights, but they're also presented with issues with these changes. So instead of organising kind of directly employed workers, they're now organising increasingly precarious and vulnerable workers who have a lot more to lose. If they're paid at the minimum, or their employer doesn't even have to fire them, they can just not put them on the rota for the next week. It's much harder to build that worker power that's required for organising and for collective bargaining. And then secondly, instead of negotiating with one direct large employer, they're instead negotiating with multiple smaller employers. So the contractors or the suppliers, and those companies can only pay the workers and offer conditions that are within the margin of what the lead company is paying them. And then finally, as we've talked about already, corporate social responsibility. A lot of companies are doing their best through CSR and MSI initiatives, but our research and research by others showed that this isn't working very effectively, and especially because it's not addressing kind of key drivers like those purchasing practices and outsourcing practices that really drive exploitation. So when we look at WSR, what you'll see here is a kind of infographic that we created as Flex to try to understand the WSR model and the different steps there that are part of it. And the WSR model seems incredibly promising. It actively addresses a lot of these gaps that I just talked about. So it enables workers' organizations to negotiate with one large entity that actually has the power in that supply chain rather than multiple smaller ones. It addresses the downward pressure on wages and conditions by setting standards for suppliers that are enforceable, but also where suppliers are actually supported by the lead company to comply with those standards. So it's not just this top-down pressure. It makes lead companies more accountable, and it also makes it possible for workers, including those who are more marginalized, to know their rights and report issues. And then finally, it introduces an independent monitoring authority or body that does thorough and proactive and regular inspections and responds to worker complaints. So a lot of the gaps that kind of are existing now, WSR really actively addresses. What makes WSR so effective, though, also makes it harder to implement. And I think that it's important to note that just getting companies to negotiate, let alone to agree to binding and enforceable standards that are designed to be effective rather than just convenient and easy, isn't easy to do. And that I think it's also good to recognize that existing WSR programs are the result of really significant and concerted effort by trade unions, by worker organizations and human rights organizations to get companies to the negotiation table and to agree to these standards and to these programs. But because of this, they also look quite different depending on the context where they've been implemented. So though most, so all WSR programs, like Theresa and Sarah were saying at the beginning, it's not about picking and choosing. There are mechanisms that have to be there for WSR to work. but still the programs can look quite different. I apologize for this slide. It's the kind of slide you should never have in a presentation because there's too much text, but I'm not, you don't have to read it. What I'm trying to show here is that, like I said, even though the mechanisms are the same, there are a lot of differences, for instance, in scale, in scope, in the length of the programs, and also kind of where consumers are located, whether they're domestic or international. So for example, if you look at the Accord, you have 2 million workers in 1,600 factories. The scale of that is kind of unprecedented. But if you then look at the scope of it, it is narrower and more specialized. So the focus is really on fire and building safety. In the transition accord, so in the kind of second iteration of the accord, there's also freedom of association related to advancing safety is also included. But overall, if you compare to the scope of Milk with Dignity or Fair Food Program, it is narrower. And also the Bangladesh Accord is time limited compared to, for instance, the Fair Food Program and Milk with Dignity that are more evergreen. So there's no end date for those WSR agreements. What I'm not saying is whether one program is better than the other. It's about the kind of the fact that they cover different things and have differences, because often as a result of what's winnable in a specific context. So you might have to make trade-offs and compromises depending on kind of how much you're able to leverage worker power or consumer pressure. So I think this is important to understand when we start looking at how these programs might be transferred into other contexts. So next I'm going to talk about the trade union context in the UK and the kind of issues that trade unions are facing in trying to tackle labour abuse in supply chains, and whether WSR could be a useful tool for tackling those issues. To do that, I don't think we didn't want to look at the entire UK labour market because it's just not possible. So we've chosen kind of one sector to try to narrow this down and really focus it. And we chose the hotel sector, specifically hotel housekeeping, as a way to kind of focus our report. And that's because it exhibits a lot of the same issues that are there in other contexts as well. So the kind of high levels of outsourcing and downward pressure from kind of the lead companies further down. So what we see is that subcontractors and agencies are competing for work using quite aggressive strategies to maintain their profit margins and to control workers, which then has led to non-compliance, but also allows lead companies to kind of wash their hands from that. So that dynamic is there. As a result, wages and conditions are really at the minimum, and the use of precarious and non-standard contracts is really the norm. And also we see kind of a higher representation of marginalized groups, especially women and migrant workers in those sectors, in this sector. And kind of as a consequence, in that sector, trade unions are facing quite an uphill battle. So workers are more precarious and afraid, and it's harder to organize them, as I've already discussed. But then also in the UK context, it's not possible for trade unions to collectively bargain with lead companies. There have been kind of legal cases to test that, and it's been ruled that you can only collectively bargain with direct employers. As a result, trade unions have to kind of keep up a constant pressure, especially where outsourcing is the norm and contracts are retendered, and there's like a high turnover of workers because work is seasonal or because workers are only in those sectors for a short amount of time, which again complicates trade unions' work. Also in the UK, there have been kind of since the 80s, there have been increasingly restrictive trade union laws that make it harder to organize and have collective action. And then finally, the UK's system for collective bargaining is quite different to the rest of Europe, for instance, where it's not a contract or an agreement that's enforced between a trade union and the employer. It's actually what's agreed is written directly into employment contracts of individuals, and then it has to be enforced by individuals, for instance, through employment tribunals. So there isn't kind of state level enforcement. or sectoral collective bargaining. So again, collective bargaining coverage is then very much tied to trade union membership, which is going to be low in sectors like this. So what we did with this report is we wanted to then talk to trade unions about whether WSR could provide a useful tool for addressing this. And the response was overall quite mixed. So there was a lot of, so people would say that it sounds great, but then how realistic is it to achieve? So hopefully that's something we can discuss today, and like seeing, for instance, having Abel here talking about it, how they have achieved it is hopefully useful. But then some other questions around kind of, is it transformative enough in terms of creating this kind of worker consciousness of their power, or is it too reliant on consumer pressure? So the quotes here in purple are from trade unions asking, in terms of sustainability, how can this be carried forward year after year, decade after decade, unless workers are ready to take their own action and not depend on the goodwill or solidarity of a consumer movement? Others were asking, well, will it provide a ceiling or a floor? So does it diminish the prospect of workers taking more meaningful, transformative action to win more significant demands? So is it possible that companies would sign up, for instance, to more limited concessions and use that to divert the kind of pressure that they might be receiving from unions or from consumers? And then finally, a question that we've been thinking ourselves, because we're looking at a service sector where it's more recently fissured, whether it makes sense to use instead other tools like bringing workers in-house. Is that more appropriate? Is that feasible? If it's not feasible, should we be using WSR instead? How can WSR complement that potentially? So there are a lot of questions that have come up. And I think it's difficult to say either way to what extent these concerns are valid, because the effectiveness and impact of a WSR program is going to depend so much on what can actually be won by the worker organizations that are, so what can be included in that WSR agreement. What we do think is that WSR provides a useful tool for unions that isn't intended to replace collective bargaining, but to support it. So for instance, the fact that it would enable unions to have a binding agreement with lead companies, so they wouldn't have to rely solely on strike action, they could rely on that binding agreement. It addresses this downward pressure on wages and conditions. It would mean you wouldn't have to constantly renegotiate or keep up the pressure, especially in sectors where contracts are often retendered or workers change often. Another thing that we explored is whether it could act as, WSR could act as a stepping stone to more transformative change. And that's something that in our research we saw had happened, for instance, in Bangladesh, where through being part of a WSR program, so unions were very much at the center of that, but through it they also gained more legitimacy and more of a voice, and found themselves being consulted more on in different parts as well, and not just on kind of health and safety side of things. And then finally, because as we saw previously, or as I discussed previously, there isn't like a limit to what a WSR agreement can cover. So you could have a WSR agreement that requires lead companies to only use contractors that are unionized. So in that way, it could support collective bargaining. I realize that I'm out of time. I just want to touch quickly on the other element of this report, which is looking at state labor market enforcement. So as I said at the beginning, we were kind of concerned about shifting responsibility away from the state. As an organization, we really see that government's responsibility is to ensure and protect workers, and also that its own policies aren't driving exploitation. And because of that, we kind of approached this scoping project as wanting to look at whether UK labour inspectorates could be involved in implementing WSR. And we kind of faced quite quickly realized that this might not be realistic. First of all, they can only implement what's in the law. So a WSR program that went beyond kind of minimum standards, which is what we would want in the UK. It wasn't, that would have to be codified into law before labour inspectorates could enforce it. And then a lot of what makes WSR effective, so for instance, the market consequences, is difficult to see how that could be run by the state, when really it's this kind of market mechanism that is the enforcement mechanism. And then finally, there's also a kind of clash there, because WSR was in a way specifically designed to deal with governance gaps left by the state. So it didn't seem like it would make sense. I guess the question that we were left with is, or that this research brought up, is we know that there are other ways to fill these governance gaps. So we could, for instance, introduce joint and several liability legislation, or we could have well-funded proactive labour inspectorates, or we could introduce safe reporting for undocumented migrants. So there are different things that we could do to fill in the kind of governance gaps in state labour market enforcement. But the question that especially proponents of, or those who were implementing WSR, are saying, well, will that political will ever be there, that we could achieve those things? And that is a question that I guess is interesting to explore. But we do think that WSR provides a real opportunity to win kind of practical gains for workers, but it shouldn't replace those kind of efforts for broader social change. Sorry for running over, and thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Meri. All right, so I'm going to introduce, I think, the panelists for the next section. Henry Chango Lopez. Henry is the president of the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain and supports some of the most marginalized workers in the UK. The union focuses on outsourcing, the gig economy, and other areas where precarity, low pay, and exploitation are the norm. Henry has been closely involved with the union from the start and previously worked as an outsourced porter at the University of London, where he was involved in high-profile campaigns. I'm going to turn it over now to Henry.
Hi, hello everyone. Yes, I'm the president of the IWGB union, which is a union that represents a lot of precarious workers, such as cleaners, hotel workers, restaurant workers, and now gig economy workers, workers who work for platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, and other companies that use the new technology. So we've been, as a union, we started organizing because of the problems that workers like cleaners have in this country, where outsourcing companies have been basically exploiting them, and they've been abandoned by the system, and they've been abandoned by the client who they work for. And the problem, as we see in many workplaces, is that when companies outsource, they tend to do that not just to cut costs, but also to wash themselves from their hands from responsibility. And that means that these workers are, in many cases, on worse terms and conditions. They are also badly treated, and the companies just do whatever they like in terms of when it comes to respect the law and also their rights at work. And for that reason, we've been campaigning in order to improve that. We've been, for instance, fighting for the London living wage, which is a wage that is above the minimum wage in this country, but it's something that employers do either voluntarily or when they are forced by campaigning, and that's what we've been doing. But we've also been organizing workers in, for example, in big universities in order to bring them in-house. And as an outsourced worker myself, I've seen the problem with outsourcing, which is a serious problem in this country. And one of the reasons we are organizing these workers, and myself as an outsourced worker have been through all the exploitation that comes with outsourcing. For example, at the University of London, where we have around 200 members, we have been campaigning for a number of years, since 2011 basically, not just for wages, but also to improve the terms and conditions in terms of sick pay, holiday, pensions. But despite winning better pay, despite winning terms and conditions in terms of sick pay, holidays, the same as direct employed staff, we have seen that the problem still remains with outsourcing companies, because in this country, most of the employers that outsource, they tender the contract either every 4 years, like in the case of universities, but in private buildings, they do like every 2 years or every year, depending on whenever they want to do. And that, when that happens, the new companies that come, they always come to with new policies. Most of them come to make more money after that contract. And that means cutting workers, that means putting them on 0 hours contracts, that means they're taking away the terms and conditions, that they, like if they had some good terms and conditions or some extra holidays or bonus, they will come and take that away from the workers as a way of making more profit out of the business. But also, so that means that every time they outsource, every company comes to do that. That means, like, for example, if there was 10 workers in a workplace 5 years ago, and 3 companies have passed since that time, now there might be like 3 workers doing the work that those 10 workers used to do before. So every time the work becomes more precarious, and that's why we've been we have seen that for example, in the University of London, that the only way to end that inequality and discrimination and exploitation is by campaigning to bring everybody in a house, so they are treated the same like direct employees. Most of these workers who we represent, which are cleaners, caterers, security guards, are migrant workers, and those are the ones who are suffering the problems with outsourcing. And so far, we've been successful in some universities bringing workers in the house, and we have seen the difference that makes of these workers being in the house. For instance, in one university, we recently brought the security guards in the house, which is called Smith University. Workers not just were on work terms and conditions, but were also, most of them were African workers. They were also not allowed to eat in the canteen where everybody eats. They were also not able to have Wi-Fi, not able to park their cars where everybody could park with direct employers. So by campaigning and bringing them in the house, they are now allowed to use all that everybody uses in the buildings. So, and they also obviously have the same terms and conditions and everybody else. They can sit with the employer, and they can be treated the same as everybody else who is direct employer, who happen to be mostly white British, who work in the administration of the university. So that's the issue with outsourcing, that we see the many problems that we have. We also see the benefits in terms of bringing in-house as a high moral in the workers. We also see the job security that they have now. One of the problems we have, and we have in terms of getting the employers to do that, is that as a union in some places, for instance, at the University of London, we don't have recognition, and we cannot afford recognition, because once you recognize an employer, once normally in the UK, if the outsourcing company already recognize a union, then other union, even if you have, let's say the other union have 1 member, we have 500 members, we cannot force recognition, we cannot sit on the table because the law doesn't allow that to happen. So we are blocked to have recognition, even like in many cases, trade, when these companies are recognizing already another union, even if they have 1 member, they will sit with that union. and negotiate on behalf of the workers. And that's what we've seen as a problem for us, and the reason to basically campaign against the client, because at the end of the day, we have seen in the University of London, that is the university who give them the better wages, who give them better conditions. Like some of the workers who we have brought in house are now like able to receive the same conditions in terms of sick pay, holiday, pension, and so we have managed to get the outsourcing companies out of the contract, and that has proved to be very beneficial for the workers and also for the union, because that means we don't have many problems to deal with as we used to have in terms of bad treatment from the managers and also the outsourcing companies. And but the other thing is that although we have managed to win campaigns and to improve the life of some of the workers, we represent many workers who work in private buildings, and they are no as big as for example, as university in terms of members. But the problem we have is that workers tend to be more afraid of organizing, but also it's difficult to have recognition with the company, because the workers, most of them tend to be migrants, and when you have recognition, you need to get them sit on the table. You need them to do the work that requires a recognition. And what we try to do normally is we try to more than like, instead of having recognition in those small workplaces, what we try to do is to improve their wages by campaigning to improve their condition as well. And that's what we target the client, because at the end of the day, the outsourcing companies, they are not the ones who have to give those conditions to the workers. Most of the time, we find not just the outsourcing company, but the client, we find them reluctant to give them any even better pay, or let alone better conditions in terms of holiday or pension, sick pay. And that's the reason we normally target the client in order to improve that situation. Another thing is that we also represent workers who work in the gig economy, and they don't have rights as workers. So that means that, for instance, they don't have rights in terms of sick pay, holiday, pensions, and that's something we've been challenging in the courts as well. They don't have rights in terms of trade union representation. So that means it's harder for us to campaign and to improve their conditions. And so we are trying to do that by campaigning, not just on streets, but politically as well, and putting pressure on the employer to improve their rights. One of the issues I see in terms of applying the WSR is that in many workplaces, as I said, what I see the positive of implementing this would be in small workplaces where the union doesn't have recognition, but maybe this could help in order to force employer to have some kind of moral responsibility, and also to respect the workers' rights. I mean, state cannot implement what the WSR is might be demanding, but I think in terms of having this agreement with employer would be helpful. Where the union doesn't have recognition, because in some of the workplaces, if we don't have the amount of members in order to force recognition, because in most of the time we need to force them. many times that we have applied for recognition, for voluntary recognition, most of the employers have rejected that because they don't want to have any responsibility. Also, they don't want to be subject to responsibility, I mean, from the union, and to have the workers to have some kind of place where they can sit with the employer and discuss the issues. But also, I see one of the issues in terms of applying this would be that we as a union, we just don't want to them to have the employer to have responsibility. We also want to have a workplace where we have workers organized but are ready in order to improve their rights in future, and also in order to fight back in case there is job cuts or there is any changes that the employer might try to do. And that's all for me.
Great, thanks, Henry. So I think, do we want to spend a little bit of time doing Q&A at this point, or do we want to go just right to closing remarks? I know we only have a couple minutes left.
No, I think we can use the time for Q&A.
Okay, great. All right, so there are a couple questions that came in. So the first one is for Meri. It says, regarding the legal barriers to unions in the UK negotiating with end customers, does this mean they would rely entirely on legal enforcement of the contract and are barred from using strike action within a WSR context?
Sorry, thank you. I think this is a good question and something that we talk about also in the report, that whereas for collective bargaining with direct employers in the UK framework, you do have legal protections, for instance, against blacklisting, against being fired for being a member of the union. Those protections don't currently exist for bargaining with or negotiating with the direct employer. But what, sorry, I've lost the question. But whether that means that you couldn't have any strike action within a WSR agreement, I don't think that there is reason why that would be barred. As I've said, it should be able to be complementary, where you can have kind of collective bargaining agreements with your direct employer and have strike action there, but then with the lead company, you have this other agreement. Ideally, you wouldn't need to, and the enforcement of the contract would be enough to maintain those conditions. And ideally, that would be the result. But it's difficult because it's a hypothetical question for me, at least. I don't know if Theresa, you want to answer, if you have anything from experience on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say briefly, you know, under the Accord, which is an agreement between labor unions in Bangladesh and also global union federations with companies, there's no restrictions on the right to strike. It's not the primary method by which the program is enforced. So the idea of creating a WSR program is to create enforcement mechanism that does not require constant campaigning and constant pressure or constant strikes, but it also does not in any way prohibit the right of workers to strike. That's still a legally protected right, and workers, you know, very much have the ability to organize it and have taken advantage of that, absolutely. Yeah. All right, and then the next question that came in, I'm not sure if this is for Meri or for one of us, but maybe Meri, you can start, is, says, what is an accepted labor condition is different across the world. In Europe, it would be unacceptable to work for 500 euros per month, whereas in East Africa, that is a huge salary. In Europe, we have a 2-day weekend, whereas in East Africa, most employees have to work Monday to Saturday. Are there examples of flexible tools or methodologies that allow to assess working conditions according to local standards and rules?
So I think within WSR, I mean, the idea is that it's worker-driven standards, and the standards are developed together with the workers. I think in a UK context, ideally they would go beyond what's the minimum in the law. But for instance, in Bangladesh, where the Accord is working, the Accord is mainly enforcing the Bangladesh law already, so the building standards of the Bangladesh government. So those are, in a way, the working conditions, and what's being enforced is kind of molded to the context in that case. But I mean, generally, employment law and having sector standards and collective bargaining agreements, those would be anything that's kind of worker driven and related to the context in which it's developed, and not kind of top down generic standards, I think is important.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so the next question is, can you tell us a bit more about inspection and enforcement? How is this set up to make sure it has sufficient capacity and independence? Maybe Abel, could you take that one and talk about the Milk with Dignity inspection program?
Sure. Yeah, so the Milk with Dignity Standards Council is an independent body. And so they'll, arrange or talk to the farmers before they sort of come to the farm and do an audit. So they'll schedule something with the farmers and sort of show up to the Milk with Dignity participating farm. And that's basically sort of how they do it. And yeah, I mean they do have the capacity to do it. It's made up of about 4 people. Since it's only 65 to 70 farms under the program, there is capacity to do it. But as we grow and as we expand the model, that's something that we take into consideration. How the Standards Council needs to grow as well. But yeah, that's basically sort of how it's done. Milk Dignity Standards Council will call the farm and they'll sort of schedule a meeting, come to the farm and talk to the workers. They talk individually, one by one, to each worker, and a meeting, could run from 30 to an hour, basically going in depth and into detail about if sort of the code of conduct is being met or not. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Abel. All right, it looks like we have 2 more questions, and I know we're just about to hit the 11:30 mark here. Maybe we can try to get to these last 2 questions, and if folks need to hop off, they can. All right. So it says, would you say you need both carrot and stick to get this to work? Incentives to comply, but also sanctions for not complying. Is there a way to do this with just the positive incentives? And I can try to answer that one quickly. I think the answer to that is it would be great if there were a way to do this with just the positive incentives. And ideally that would be the way that it would work. But I think, unfortunately what we've seen is that even if you have all those positives incentives in place, you still wind up with suppliers that are unwilling for whatever reason to take the steps that they're being directed to take to correct the abuses or correct the violations. And so in that case, you do ultimately have to have the stick, and you do have to have enforcement mechanisms in place. One of the phrases that we use quite often to describe, some of these other types of voluntary programs are standards without enforcement. And so at the end of the day, you do have to have effective enforcement mechanisms, because there will always be, some suppliers that are unwilling to respond to those positive incentives. Okay, great. And then there's just one more, and it says, with respect to principle number 6 on independent verification of compliance, can you share an example of companies going beyond audits and how this has worked in practice? So, I don't know if Sarah or Bell, if either of you want to take that question. No. Okay. So I'm not entirely sure what it means by beyond audit. So I think when we're talking about independent verification of compliance under a WSR program, what we're talking about are independent inspections by individuals that are qualified to carry out those inspections, that are done using primarily interviews with workers conducted in conditions in which workers are comfortable speaking candidly, and that that's combined with a robust complaint mechanism and workers being educated about their rights under the program and how to file complaints. I know the phrase beyond auditing has, is kind of being used, I think, in a lot of CSR spheres to kind of sort of create the idea that there is something you can do that is more than auditing. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is that a lot of those things that are being described as going beyond auditing lack the kinds of enforcement and incentives that are necessary to actually fundamentally change conditions. So I don't know that we're necessarily saying that what we're doing is going beyond auditing, but actually simply creating a program that is both standards and enforcement, rather than simply auditing without effective enforcement.
Okay, thank you very much, Theresa, and thanks to all our speakers, especially Henry and Abel. We know that probably you're dealing with much higher demands at the moment. And to everyone at home for participating and for your questions and comments. We will close the webinar here as we run out of time, but this is actually a good thing, I suppose. And we will share the slides with all the participants. And as mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be available online on our website, which is laborexploitation.org. So thank you very much.